Stephen Kim had always been a light sleeper, but lately the insomnia was getting worse. He would lie awake until 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city filtering through his apartment window. His mind would race with work stress, family expectations, and a gnawing sense that something fundamental was missing from his life. The prescription sleep aids made him groggy the next day, and the melatonin barely touched the surface of his restlessness. It was on one of those particularly brutal nights, after he'd been tossing and turning for hours, that he found himself padding barefoot to the living room, where his roommate Charles Rodriguez was crashed on the couch, laptop balanced on his chest as he worked late on some freelance graphic design project. The soft glow of the screen illuminated Charles's concentrated expression, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that made Stephen's chest tighten with something he'd been trying not to name for months. "Can't sleep again?" Charles asked without looking up from his screen, his voice soft with concern that sent warmth spreading through Stephen's stomach. Stephen nodded, settling into the armchair across from the couch, pulling his knees up to his chest. Charles finally looked up, and Stephen caught the full force of those warm brown eyes that had been haunting his thoughts more and more lately. Quote, Stephen's heart did something complicated in his chest. "Yeah, I think it's just having someone else around, not feeling so alone in the space." Charles closed his laptop and set it aside, giving Stephen his full attention. "Actually, this might sound crazy, but would you want to try sleeping in my room tonight?" "Not like that," he added quickly, a flush creeping up his neck. "I just mean, maybe having someone nearby would help you sleep too." "Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." Stephen's mouth went dry. The offer was innocent enough, practical even, but something in Charles's voice, in the way he was looking at Stephen like he was trying to solve a puzzle, made Stephen's pulse quicken. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable." "You wouldn't be. I have a king-size bed, and honestly, if it helps you get some sleep, I'm all for it. You look exhausted, man." The concern in Charles's voice was genuine, but there was something else there too. Something that made Stephen wonder if his roommate had been having the same confusing thoughts that had been keeping Stephen awake at night. The same thoughts that made him notice how Charles's laugh filled their apartment with warmth, how he always made sure to cook enough dinner for two without being asked, how he'd started lingering in doorways when they talked, as if he didn't want their conversations to end. "Okay," Stephen heard himself saying, the word coming out barely above a whisper. "If you're sure it won't be weird." Charles smiled, and Stephen felt something shift in the air between them, like a door opening that neither of them had realized was there. "I'm sure, come on." That night, lying in Charles's bed with 3 feet of space between them, Stephen found himself drifting off to sleep more easily than he had in months. He was dimly aware of Charles's steady breathing beside him, the warmth radiating from his body, the way the mattress dipped slightly under his weight. For the first time in weeks, Stephen's mind quieted, and he slept deeply until morning. When he woke up, Charles was already gone, probably off to his morning run, but there was a note on the pillow beside him. Quote, 12. Stephen stared at the note for a long moment, his heart doing that complicated dance again. Something had changed between them last night, something subtle but undeniable. The question was what they were going to do about it. To understand how they had arrived at this moment, Stephen would have to go back 3 months earlier, to the day Charles had first answered his Craigslist ad for a roommate. Stephen had been living alone in his 2-bedroom apartment for almost a year, ever since his ex-girlfriend had moved out, taking most of the furniture and leaving behind an echoing emptiness that seemed to grow larger every day. The rent was too expensive for one person. But Stephen had been putting off finding a roommate because the idea of sharing his space with a stranger felt overwhelming. Charles had been the 5th person to respond to his ad, and the first one who didn't immediately give Stephen a bad feeling. His email had been straightforward and friendly, mentioning that he was a freelance graphic designer looking for a quiet place to work, that he was clean, responsible, and looking for a roommate who could respect boundaries while still being friendly. When they met for coffee to discuss the arrangement, Stephen had been struck by how easy Charles was to talk to, how his presence seemed to fill the space around them without being overwhelming. Charles was shorter than Stephen by a few inches, with an athletic build that spoke of regular gym sessions and weekend hiking trips. His smile was quick and genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that made Stephen want to keep talking just to see it again. He had an easy confidence that Stephen envied, the kind of person who could strike up conversations with strangers and make friends wherever he went. I'm pretty low-key, Charles had said over his cappuccino, stirring in an extra packet of sugar. I work mostly from home, so I'd be around a lot, but I'm good at staying out of the way. I like to cook, though, so if you don't mind sharing kitchen space, I'd be happy to make enough for two sometimes. Stephen had found himself nodding before Charles had even finished speaking. There was something about him that felt safe, comfortable in a way that Stephen hadn't experienced with anyone in a long time. Therefore, in 16. Within a week, Charles had moved his belongings into the spare bedroom, and Stephen's apartment had been transformed. Charles brought warmth and life to the space in ways Stephen hadn't expected. He hung colorful prints on the walls, filled the living room with plants that somehow thrived under his care, and always seemed to have music playing softly in the background. The apartment smelled like coffee and the lavender candles Charles liked to burn while he worked. More than that, though, Charles brought a sense of companionship that Stephen hadn't realized he had been desperately missing. They fell into an easy routine of shared meals and evening conversations, Charles telling stories about his clients and his weekend adventures, while Stephen talked about his job at the marketing firm and his ongoing struggles with his family's expectations that he settle down and get married. My mom keeps setting me up with her friends' daughters, Stephen had confided one evening as they sat on the couch after dinner. Charles's feet tucked under him in a way that made him look younger than his 28 years. Tat point, I quote him. Charles had asked, and something in his tone made Stephen look at him more carefully. Quote Guanayapom. Stephen had paused, studying Charles's face in the soft lamplight. Someone who makes me feel like I'm home. Charles had gone very still, his eyes fixed on Stephen's face with an intensity that made Stephen's breath catch. That sounds nice, he'd said quietly. Quote 23. Charles had shaken his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Quote 24. The conversation had ended there, but Stephen had found himself thinking about it for days afterward, replaying the way Charles had looked at him, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. As the weeks passed, Stephen began to notice things about Charles that made his chest tighten with feelings he wasn't ready to name. The way Charles hummed while he cooked, completely unconscious and off-key, in a way that was endearing rather than annoying. How he always asked about Stephen's day and actually listened to the answer, remembering details from previous conversations and following up on things Stephen had mentioned being worried about. The way he laughed at Stephen's jokes, even the bad ones, with genuine amusement that lit up his whole face. Stephen found himself looking forward to coming home in a way he never had before, knowing that Charles would be there with stories about his day and questions about Stephen's. Their evening conversations stretched longer and longer, both of them seeming reluctant to end the connection and retreat to their separate rooms. It was during one of these conversations, about 6 weeks after Charles had moved in, that Stephen first began to suspect that his feelings might not be entirely one-sided. They had been talking about relationships, as they often did, and Charles had mentioned his last girlfriend. Charles had said, swirling the wine in his glass as he spoke. Charles had been quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on something Stephen couldn't see. I realized I was trying to talk myself into loving her. Like I cared about her, but I kept waiting for that feeling everyone talks about, you know? That sense of rightness, of this is the person I want to spend my life with. It never came. Maybe you just weren't ready. Maybe. Charles had looked up then, meeting Stephen's eyes directly. Quote 31. The words had hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility, and Stephen had felt his heart start to race. But before he could figure out how to respond, Charles had changed the subject, asking about Stephen's plans for the weekend, and the moment had passed. But moments like that kept happening, small instances of connection that felt like they meant something more than friendship. Charles started finding excuses to touch Stephen casually, a hand on his shoulder when he passed behind him in the kitchen, fingers brushing when they reached for the same thing, hugs that lasted just a beat longer than strictly necessary. Stephen found himself doing the same thing, drawn to Charles in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. The sleeping arrangement had started innocently enough, born out of Stephen's genuine struggle with insomnia and Charles's practical suggestion. But after that first night, when Stephen had slept better than he had in months, it became a regular thing. Charles would ask in that careful way of his if Stephen wanted to try sleeping in his room again, and Stephen would say yes, telling himself it was just about getting a good night's sleep. But lying there in the dark next to Charles, listening to his breathing even out as he drifted off to sleep, Stephen had to acknowledge that it was about more than insomnia. There was something profoundly intimate about sharing that space, about the trust implicit in sleeping next to someone, vulnerable and unguarded. Charles always fell asleep first, and Stephen would lie awake for a while, hyper aware of every sound Charles made, every shift of his body under the covers. Sometimes Charles would talk in his sleep, soft murmurs that Stephen could never quite make out, but that sounded almost like his name. Sometimes he would reach out in his sleep, his arms stretching across the space between them as if searching for something, and Stephen would have to resist the urge to move closer, to let Charles's searching hand find him. The morning after their third night sharing the bed, Stephen woke up to find Charles closer than usual, close enough that Stephen could feel the warmth of his breath against his neck. Charles's arm was stretched across the space between them, his fingers just barely touching Stephen's shoulder. Stephen lay very still, not wanting to wake him, not wanting to break the spell of this moment. When Charles finally stirred, his eyes opening slowly and focusing on Stephen's face just inches away, neither of them moved for a long moment. Stephen could see flecks of gold in Charles's brown eyes, could count his eyelashes, could feel the slight puff of Charles's breath against his skin. Quote 32. Charles had whispered, his voice rough with sleep. Quote 33. Stephen had whispered back, and something in Charles's expression shifted, became more intent, more focused. For a heartbeat, Stephen thought Charles might lean closer, might close the small distance between them. But then Charles's alarm had gone off, shattering the moment, and they had both pulled back, the spell broken. That day at work, Stephen found himself unable to concentrate on anything. His mind kept drifting back to that moment in Charles's bed, to the look in Charles's eyes, to the way his heart had hammered against his ribs when he thought Charles might kiss him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wanted Charles to kiss him. He wanted it so badly it made his chest ache. Stephen had never thought of himself as gay. He'd dated women exclusively throughout high school and college, had even been in love with his ex-girlfriend Sarah, or thought he had been. But looking back now, he couldn't remember ever feeling the kind of electric anticipation with Sarah that he felt just thinking about Charles. He'd never lain awake at night thinking about the way Sarah laughed, or felt his pulse quicken when she walked into a room. The thought should have been more frightening than it was. Stephen had grown up in a conservative family, had absorbed all the usual messages about what was normal and acceptable. But somehow, when it came to Charles, those voices seemed distant and unimportant. What mattered was the way Charles made him feel alive in a way he'd never experienced before. The way their conversations could stretch for hours without either of them getting bored. The way Charles seemed to see and appreciate parts of Stephen that no one else had ever noticed. That evening, Stephen came home to find Charles cooking dinner, as he often did. Charles had changed out of his work clothes into a soft gray sweater that brought out the warmth in his eyes, and his hair was slightly mussed from running his hands through it while he worked. He looked up when Stephen walked into the kitchen, smiling in that way that made Stephen's stomach flip. "How was your day?" Charles asked, stirring something that smelled amazing on the stove. "Better now," Stephen said without thinking, and then felt heat rise in his cheeks at the admission. Charles's smile widened, and he turned back to the stove, but Stephen caught the pleased expression on his face. They ate dinner on the couch, as had become their habit, plates balanced on their laps while they watched a cooking show Charles was obsessed with. Stephen found himself stealing glances at Charles throughout the meal, noticing the way he got animated when talking about the techniques the chefs were using, how he gestured with his fork when he was excited about something. Podcast 37. Charles said during a commercial break, quote 138. Stephen's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Yeah, I think I know what you mean now. I've been thinking about it a lot, actually." Charles set his plate away aside and turned to face Stephen more fully. I don't think I've ever had that feeling with anyone I've dated. That sense of rightness, of being completely myself with someone. It's rare, Stephen said carefully, not sure where Charles was going with this. Is it, though, or do we just convince ourselves it is because we're looking in the wrong places? Charles's eyes were fixed on Stephen's face with that same intensity Stephen had noticed before. What if the person who makes you feel at home is someone you never expected? Someone who's been right there the whole time? Stephen's heart was pounding so hard he was sure Charles could hear it. Code 45, Charles continued, his voice soft but determined. Stephen set his plate aside with shaking hands, his mind reeling. Charles trailed off, his cheeks flushing. Charles took a shaky breath. The admission hung in the air between them, electric and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Stephen felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into something that would change his life forever. So Stephen said quietly, Charles's eyes widened. Really? Really, I've never felt this way about a guy before, Charles. I've never felt this way about anyone before. It scares the hell out of me, but I can't pretend it's not happening. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their confession settling between them. Stephen could hear his own heartbeat, could see the rapid rise and fall of Charles's chest, could feel the electric tension that seemed to fill the space around them. Quote 56. Charles asked finally. Stephen looked at him, at this man who had become so important to him without his even realizing it was happening, and felt something settle into place in his chest. Quote 57. Charles smiled, that soft, genuine smile that had been undoing Stephen for months. They moved toward each other without conscious thought, drawn together by something stronger than fear or uncertainty. When Charles's hand came up to cup Stephen's face, his thumb brushing across Stephen's cheekbone, Stephen felt like every nerve ending in his body came alive. "Can I kiss you?" Charles whispered, his forehead almost touching Stephen's. Stephen nodded, not trusting his voice, and then Charles's lips were on his, soft and warm and perfect. The kiss started tentative, questioning, but when Stephen kissed him back, Charles made a soft sound of relief and deepened the connection. Stephen's hands found their way to Charles's shoulders, pulling him closer, and Charles responded by threading his fingers through Stephen's hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Charles rested his forehead against Stephen's. "Wow," he breathed. "Yeah," Stephen agreed, his voice shaky. "Wow." They sat like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, sharing the same air, both of them seeming afraid to move and break the spell. "I'm scared," Charles admitted quietly. "Me too," Stephen said, "but I'm more scared of pretending this isn't happening." Charles pulled back just enough to meet Stephen's eyes. Stephen said honestly, quote 68. Charles smiled and Stephen felt something warm and bright unfurl in his chest. Quote 69. They spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking, about what they were feeling and what it might mean. Charles admitted that he'd been questioning his sexuality for months, that his relationships with women had always felt like he was playing a role rather than being himself. Stephen talked about how he'd never understood what people meant when they talked about being attracted to someone until he'd met Charles, how every previous relationship had felt like he was going through the motions. "I keep thinking about my ex," Stephen said as they sat curled together on the couch, Charles's head on his shoulder. 71, quote 72, Charles said, his fingers tracing absent patterns on Stephen's arm. "I spent so much time trying to make myself feel things I thought I should feel. It's exhausting, isn't it? Trying to be someone you're not." "Yeah, it is." Stephen pressed a kiss to the top of Charles's head, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. Quote 75. That night they slept in Charles's bed again, but this time there was no pretense about insomnia. They fell asleep facing each other, fingers intertwined between them, and Stephen woke up with Charles curled against his side, warm and solid and real. Over the next few weeks, they navigated this new territory between them carefully, both aware that they were venturing into uncharted waters. They talked constantly about their fears and hopes and the strange relief of finally understanding themselves. They kissed often, soft, exploratory kisses that left Stephen dizzy with want and wonder. Charles was patient with Stephen's uncertainty, never pushing for more than Stephen was ready for, always checking in to make sure they were moving at a pace that felt right for both of them. Stephen had never been with a man before, had never even kissed one before Charles, and the physical aspect of their relationship was a revelation. Charles's body was different from any woman's he'd been with, all lean muscle and sharp angles, but it felt right in a way that made Stephen's previous relationships seem like pale imitations of the real thing. 3 weeks after their first kiss, Stephen finally worked up the courage to call his sister Elena, the one member of his family he thought might understand. Elena had always been the more progressive one, the one who'd moved to San Francisco and worked in tech and dated people their parents didn't approve of. Quote 77, Stephen said without preamble when Elena picked up the phone. Quote 7, Elena said, but her tone was warm and concerned. Quote 78, quote 70, there was a pause and Stephen held his breath, waiting for her reaction. Quote 80, Elena said finally, quote 81. The question caught Stephen off guard. He'd been prepared for shock, maybe disapproval, possibly a lecture about how this was just a phase. He hadn't expected such simple acceptance. Stephen said, and realized as he said it, that it was true. Elena said simply. Quote idea. Stephen found himself talking for almost an hour, telling Elena about Charles, about how they'd met and how their friendship had evolved into something deeper. Elena listened without judgment, asking questions that showed she was really paying attention, really trying to understand. He sounds wonderful, Elena said when Stephen finally ran out of words. When do I get to meet him? You want to meet him? Of course I want to meet him. He's important to you, which makes him important to me. Elena paused. Stephen, you know Mom and Dad are going to struggle with this, right? Stephen's stomach clenched. After he hung up with Elena, Stephen felt lighter than he had in weeks. Having someone in his family know and accept this part of him felt like a gift he hadn't known he needed. Charles was waiting for him when he got home, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop, working on a logo design for a local restaurant. He looked up when Stephen walked in, and his face immediately softened with concern. How did it go? Charles asked, closing his laptop and giving Stephen his full attention. Better than I expected, Stephen said, settling into the chair next to Charles. She wants to meet you. Charles's eyebrows rose. Quote 96, quote 97. Charles reached over and took Stephen's hand, intertwining their fingers. How do you feel about that? Terrified, Stephen admitted, but also relieved. It feels good to have someone know, someone who accepts us. We don't have to rush anything, Charles said gently. We can take this as slow as you need. Stephen looked at him, at this man who had turned his world upside down in the best possible way, and felt a surge of love so strong it took his breath away. I love you, he said without thinking, and then immediately went red. Charles's face broke into a radiant smile. Kotonovid, he said, leaning over to kiss Stephen softly. Charles cupped Stephen's face in his hands. I love how brave you're being, figuring out who you are and what you want. I love you. Stephen Kim. Stephen felt tears prick at his eyes. No one had ever said his name like that before, like it was something precious and important. I love you too, Charles Rodriguez. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. They spent that evening planning a weekend trip to visit Elena, Charles nervous but excited about meeting someone from Stephen's family. Stephen watched him research restaurants in Elena's neighborhood, saw how much it meant to him to make a good impression, and felt his heart swell with affection. She's going to love you, Stephen assured him, wrapping his arms around Charles from behind as he sat at his laptop. How can you be sure? Because I love you, and Elena wants me to be happy, and you make me happier than I've ever been. Charles leaned back against Stephen's chest, tilting his head to look up at him. The trip to visit Elena went better than Stephen had dared to hope. Elena welcomed Charles with open arms, and within an hour of meeting him, she was treating him like he'd been part of the family for years. Stephen watched them laugh together over dinner, saw the way Elena's eyes lit up when Charles told stories about his work, and felt a deep sense of rightness settle in his chest. Quote 115, Elena told Stephen quietly while Charles was in the bathroom. Quote, one it's skis, quote, one adopting, Stephen admitted. Quote, one eighties, quote, Brian, quote, one inch. Elena smiled and squeezed his hand. Quote, twin. On the drive home, Charles was quiet, staring out the window at the passing landscape. Stephen glanced over at him, noting the thoughtful expression on his face. Quote 122, Stephen said. Charles turned to look at him, smiling softly. Quote 112, quote 112, quote 25. Charles reached over and took Stephen's hand where it rested on the gear shift. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, you know? For something to go wrong or for this to turn out to be too good to be true. Stephen understood exactly what Charles meant. He'd been having the same thoughts, the same fears that this happiness was too perfect to last. Charles was quiet for a moment, processing this. Quote 130, he said finally. Quote Warren. Quote 130. Stephen agreed. Quote 130. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, hands linked between them, both lost in their own thoughts. Stephen found himself thinking about the future, something he'd been afraid to do before. For the first time in his life, he could picture himself with someone long-term, could imagine building a life with another person that felt authentic and fulfilling. When they got home, they fell into their evening routine with an ease that spoke of how naturally they fit together. Charles cooked while Stephen set the table and opened a bottle of wine. They ate dinner on the couch, talking about Elena and the weekend, about Charles's upcoming projects, and Stephen's latest work drama. Later, as they got ready for bed, Stephen caught Charles's eye in the bathroom mirror as they brushed their teeth side by side. Charles grinned around his toothbrush, and Stephen couldn't help but grin back, struck by how domestic and normal and perfect this moment was. In bed, they curled together as had become their habit, Charles's head on Stephen's chest, Stephen's fingers running through Charles's hair. This was Stephen's favorite time of day, when the world outside their bedroom door ceased to exist and it was just the two of them, quiet and content and completely themselves. Quote 134. Charles said quietly, his breath warm against Stephen's skin. Yeah, thank you. For what? Charles lifted his head to look at him. For being brave enough to let this happen, for not running when things got scary, for letting me love you. Stephen felt his throat tighten with emotion. Thank you for seeing me, for making me feel like I was worth loving exactly as I am. Charles leaned up to kiss him, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, Charles settled back against Stephen's chest with a contented sigh. Charles murmured, already half asleep. Quote 131. Stephen whispered back, pressing a kiss to the top of Charles's head. As Charles's breathing evened out and he drifted off to sleep, Stephen lay awake for a while, not because of insomnia this time, but because he wanted to savor this moment. The weight of Charles in his arms, the sound of his quiet breathing, the profound sense of peace that had settled over his life since they'd stopped pretending to be just friends. 6 months ago, Stephen had been a different person, going through the motions of a life that didn't really fit him, trying to want things he thought he should want. Now lying here with Charles sleeping peacefully in his arms, Stephen couldn't imagine being anyone else or wanting anything other than exactly what he had. The next morning, Stephen woke up before Charles for once and lay still for a few minutes, watching him sleep. Charles's face was soft and unguarded in sleep, his hair mussed and falling across his forehead in a way that made Stephen's chest tight with affection. Stephen thought about all the mornings they'd woken up in this bed together, how each one had felt like a small miracle. When Charles finally stirred, his eyes opening slowly and focusing on Stephen's face, he smiled that sleepy, contented smile that never failed to make Stephen's heart skip. Would one foreign, Charles murmured, his voice rough with sleep. Quote, Warchin. Stephen replied, leaning down to kiss him gently. They lay there for a while, trading lazy kisses and quiet conversation, neither of them in any hurry to start the day. This was another thing Stephen loved about their relationship, how comfortable they were with these quiet moments, how they could be together without needing to fill every silence. Eventually, the need for coffee drove them out of bed, and they padded to the kitchen together. Charles immediately starting the coffee maker while Stephen pulled ingredients out of the refrigerator to make breakfast. They moved around each other with practiced ease, Charles dropping a kiss on Stephen's shoulder as he passed behind him, Stephen's hand finding the small of Charles's back as he reached around him for a mug. I was thinking, Charles said as they sat at the kitchen table with their coffee and the omelet Stephen had made. Maybe it's time we told some more people about us. I mean, if you're ready. Stephen considered this, sipping his coffee. The idea still made him nervous, but it also felt right. He was tired of hiding this part of himself, tired of pretending that Charles was just his roommate when he was so much more than that. Who were you thinking? Well, my sister Maria has been asking why I seem so happy lately, and maybe some of our friends. Philip Gray has been wanting to have us over for dinner for weeks, and I keep making an excuse because I don't know how to explain why we'd want to come together. Stephen nodded slowly. Philip was a mutual friend they'd made through Charles's work, and Stephen had always liked him. He seemed like the kind of person who would be accepting, who would be happy for them. Okay, Stephen said, let's do it. Let's tell people. Charles's face lit up with a smile that made Stephen's heart skip. Really? Really, I'm tired of hiding us. I want people to know that I'm with you, that you're mine and I'm yours. Charles reached across the table and took Stephen's hand. Quote 152. Over the next few weeks, they slowly began coming out to their friends and chosen family. Each conversation was different, some easier than others, but the response was overwhelmingly positive. Philip Gray had indeed been thrilled for them, immediately inviting them to dinner as a couple and spending the evening telling embarrassing stories about his own dating life. Charles's sister Maria had cried happy tears over video chat, saying she'd never seen her brother look so content. The hardest conversation was still ahead of them, though. Stephen knew he would eventually have to tell his parents, and the thought filled him with a dread that sat heavy in his stomach. His parents were traditional, conservative people who had very specific ideas about what Stephen's life should look like. A male partner was definitely not part of that vision. Charles never pressured him about it, but Stephen could see the question in his eyes sometimes. The careful way Charles avoided mentioning Stephen's parents or asking about family gatherings. Stephen appreciated Charles's patience, but he also knew it wasn't fair to keep this part of his life separate indefinitely. The decision was made for him when his mother called one evening while he and Charles were cooking dinner together. Cochero. His mother said without preamble when he answered the phone, Stephen's blood ran cold. He glanced at Charles, who had gone very still at the stove, obviously having heard enough to understand what was happening. Next weekend? Stephen managed to say. That's pretty short notice, Mom. I know, but your father has a conference in the city, and we thought we'd make a trip of it. We could take you and your roommate out to dinner, maybe see a show. Stephen's mind raced. He could make excuses, could tell his parents that Charles would be out of town or that the timing wasn't good. But as he looked at Charles, saw the carefully neutral expression on his face, Stephen realized he was tired of making excuses. He was tired of hiding the most important relationship in his life from the people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. Actually, Mom, there's something I need to tell you before you come, Stephen said, his heart pounding. About Charles. He's not just my roommate anymore. He's my boyfriend. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Stephen could hear his mother's sharp intake of breath, could practically feel her shock through the phone. His mother repeated finally, her voice carefully controlled. Kodupituen. Another long pause. Quote, Wextuant. The line went dead and Stephen stared at his phone, his hands shaking slightly. Charles immediately crossed to him, pulling him into a tight hug. Quote, Wetrawam. Charles asked gently. Quote, Waherchistin. Stephen admitted, burying his face in Charles's neck. But also relieved. I'm so tired of hiding us. Whatever happens, we'll get through it together, Charles said, pressing a kiss to Stephen's temple. Quote, Bound 7. Stephen pulled back to look at him, struck once again by how lucky he was to have found this man. Quote 168. The next few days passed in a blur of nervous preparation. Charles was supportive but understandably anxious about meeting Stephen's parents under these circumstances. Stephen found himself cleaning the apartment obsessively, as if having perfectly arranged throw pillows would somehow make his parents more accepting of his relationship. Friday evening arrived too quickly. Stephen's parents knocked on the door at exactly 6 o'clock, because his father was nothing if not punctual. Stephen took a deep breath, squeezed Charles's hand once for luck, and opened the door. His parents looked exactly as they always did. His father in his best suit, his mother in a dress that was probably more expensive than Stephen's monthly rent. They both smiled politely at Stephen, but he could see the tension in their faces, the careful way they were holding themselves. "Mom, Dad, this is Charles," Stephen said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Charles, these are my parents, Eugene Nelson and Ruth Thompson." Charles stepped forward with that easy confidence Stephen had always admired, extending his hand to Stephen's father. 71. Stephen's father shook Charles's hand, his expression unreadable. His mother managed a tight smile but didn't offer her hand. "Please, come in," Stephen said, stepping aside to let them enter. The evening was awkward in the way Stephen had expected it to be, but not quite as terrible as he'd feared. His parents were polite to Charles, asking careful questions about his work and his family, but Stephen could feel the undercurrent of disapproval. The way they avoided looking at Stephen and Charles when they were sitting close together on the couch. Dinner was at a neutral restaurant, conversations stilted and focused on safe topics like work and the weather. Stephen found himself watching his parents, trying to read their expressions, trying to figure out what they were thinking. It wasn't until they were back at the apartment, his parents preparing to leave for their hotel, that the real conversation finally happened. "Stephen, could we speak with you privately for a moment?" his mother asked, glancing meaningfully at Charles. Charles immediately stood up. "I'll just go to work on some designs in the bedroom," he said, squeezing Stephen's shoulder as he passed. When Charles was gone, Stephen's parents sat back down, both looking at him with expressions of concern and disappointment that made Stephen's chest tighten. "Quote Yanim," his father began, his voice gentle but firm. "Quote quote in," Stephen said quietly. "Quote Wani." His mother leaned forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Quote Wabin." Stephen felt a familiar surge of frustration, the same feeling he'd had countless times growing up when his parents had tried to shape him into their vision of who he should be. But this time he also felt something else, a quiet certainty about who he was and what he wanted. "I'm not confused, Mom," Stephen said firmly. "I'm gay. I've probably always been gay. I just didn't understand it before. And Charles isn't a phase or a mistake. He's the person I want to spend my life with." His parents exchanged a look, and Stephen could see the disappointment and worry in their faces. "We love you, Stephen," his father said finally, "but we can't support this choice. We hope you'll come to your senses and find your way back to the life God intended for you." The words hit Stephen like a physical blow, but he forced himself to stand up straighter, to meet his parents' eyes directly. Stephen said. His parents left shortly after that, the goodbye awkward and strained. Stephen closed the door behind them and leaned against it, feeling emotionally drained but also oddly relieved. He'd done it. He'd told his parents the truth about who he was, and while their reaction wasn't what he'd hoped for, he'd survived it. Charles emerged from the bedroom a few minutes later, his face full of concern. "How did it go?" "About as well as I expected," Stephen said with a rueful smile. "They're disappointed and worried and hoping I'll come to my senses. But I told them the truth and I'm not taking it back." Charles crossed to him and pulled him into a tight hug. "I'm proud of you," he murmured against Stephen's ear. Quote 190, quote Mayon, Stephen admitted, quote Kinahons. They spent the rest of the evening curled together on the couch talking about the future, about the possibility that Stephen's parents might come around eventually and the reality that they might not. It was a difficult conversation, but also a necessary one, and Stephen felt closer to Charles than ever when they finally went to bed. "Whatever happens with your family," Charles said as they lay in the dark, "you have me. You have Elena. You have Maria. You have all the friends who love and support us. You're not alone in this." "I know," Stephen said, pressing a kiss to Charles's forehead. Opera 96. Over the next few months, Stephen's relationship with his parents remained strained, but not completely severed. They spoke on the phone occasionally, careful conversations that avoided any mention of Charles or Stephen's personal life. It wasn't ideal, but Stephen had made peace with it. He'd chosen his own happiness over their approval, and while it hurt, he knew it was the right choice. Meanwhile, his relationship with Charles continued to deepen and grow. They talked about moving to a bigger apartment together, about Charles meeting more of Stephen's extended family, about what their future might look like. These conversations filled Stephen with a sense of possibility and excitement that he'd never experienced before. One evening in late spring, almost a year after Charles had first moved in, they were sitting on their small balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Charles was quiet, seemingly lost in thought, and Stephen was content to sit in comfortable silence beside him. Quote 197. Charles said suddenly, turning to face him with an expression that was both nervous and excited. Quote when I eat. Quote man. Charles took a deep breath, his hands fidgeting with his wine glass. Quote another 200. Stephen's heart started to race, but in a good the way it always did when Charles looked at him like he was something precious and important. I do, Stephen said without hesitation. I can't imagine my future without you in it. Charles's face broke into a radiant smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, and Stephen's breath caught in his throat. Charles, I know we can't legally get married yet, Charles said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion, but I want to make a promise to you anyway. I want to promise that I'll love you and support you and be your partner in everything, for as long as you'll have me. He opened the box to reveal two simple silver bands. Will you wear this? Will you let me call you my husband, even if it's just between us for now? Stephen felt tears prick at his eyes as he looked at the rings, then at Charles's hopeful, nervous face. A year ago, he'd been sleepless and lonely, going through the motions of a life that didn't fit him. Now he was being offered everything he'd never known he wanted. Yes, Stephen said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, of course, yes. Charles's hands shook as he slipped the ring onto Stephen's finger, and Stephen did the same for him, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. The rings were perfect, simple and elegant and exactly right. I love you, husband, Charles said, testing out the word with a grin. I love you too, husband, Stephen replied, and then Charles was kissing him, deep and passionate and full of promise. They stayed on the balcony until long after dark, talking about their plans, about the wedding they'd have someday when the law caught up with their hearts, about the life they were going to build together. Stephen felt like he was glowing from the inside out, filled with a happiness so complete it almost hurt. Later, lying in bed with Charles curled against his side, Stephen thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. All those sleepless nights, all that confusion and longing and fear, had led him here, to this perfect sense of rightness and belonging. Quote 212, he said quietly. Quote darn, Charles lifted his head to look at him, smiling that soft, contented smile that Stephen had fallen in love with. Quote Stephen whispered, pulling Charles closer. Quote as Charles drifted off to sleep in his arms, Stephen lay awake for a while, not because of insomnia this time, but because he wanted to savor this moment, this perfect sense of completeness. He thought about his younger self, struggling to understand why nothing had ever felt quite right, why he'd always felt like he was playing a role in his own life. Now he understood. He'd been waiting for Charles, waiting for this love that made everything else make sense. He'd been waiting to become the person he was meant to be, the person Charles saw and loved so completely. Stephen pressed a kiss to the top of Charles's head and closed his eyes, finally ready to sleep, knowing that when he woke up, Charles would still be there, and they would have forever to figure out the rest of their story together. The morning light filtered through their bedroom curtains, casting golden patterns across the sheets as Stephen woke up slowly, consciousness returning in gentle waves. The first thing he became aware of was the weight of the ring on his finger, still new enough to feel foreign but already precious beyond measure. The second thing was Charles's arm draped across his chest, the steady rhythm of his breathing indicating he was still deeply asleep. Stephen lay still for a while, watching Charles sleep, marveling at how different his life looked now compared to just 18 months ago. Back then, he'd been going through the motions of a life that had never quite fit, dating women he'd cared about but never truly loved, working a job that paid the bills but didn't fulfill him, living in an apartment that felt more like a way station than a home. Now, everything had changed. The apartment was still the same, but it felt completely different, with Charles's presence filling it with warmth and life. Stephen's job hadn't changed, but he approached it with new energy, no longer feeling like he was just marking time until something better came along. He had something better now, something that made every day feel full of possibility. Most importantly, he had Charles, this incredible man who had seen something in Stephen that Stephen hadn't even known existed. Charles had been patient with his confusion, supportive through his family struggles, and loving in a way that made Stephen feel like he was finally, truly home. As if sensing Stephen's attention, Charles began to stir, his arm tightening around Stephen's chest as he made those soft, sleepy sounds that Stephen had grown to love. When Charles's eyes finally opened, focusing on Stephen's face with that same wonder that was there every morning, Stephen felt his heart do that familiar skip. Quotai. Charles murmured, his voice rough with sleep, and Stephen felt a thrill run through him at the word. Quote 219, Stephen replied, leaning down to kiss Charles softly. They had coffee on the balcony, as had become their weekend tradition. Charles reading aloud from articles on his phone while Stephen listened and watched the city wake up around them. It was such a simple pleasure, but one that filled Stephen with profound contentment. This was what he'd been searching for without knowing it. This sense of partnership and companionship and deep, abiding love. I was thinking, Charles said, setting down his coffee mug and turning to face Stephen more fully. Maybe it's time we started looking for a bigger place. Somewhere that's really ours, that we choose together. Stephen felt a flutter of excitement at the suggestion. The apartment had served them well, but Charles was right. It was time for something that belonged to both of them from the beginning. I'd like that, Stephen said. Somewhere with a real kitchen, maybe, so you can spread out when you're cooking those elaborate Sunday dinners. And a proper office space for both of us, Charles added, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. Somewhere you can work from home when you want to, and I can have clients over for meetings. They spent the rest of the morning looking at apartment listings online, dreaming about hardwood floors and big windows, and enough closet space for both of their belongings. It felt like the next natural step in their relationship, this decision to build something together from the ground up. That afternoon, they went to visit Elena, who had become a regular part of their lives since that first meeting. She welcomed them with her usual warmth, immediately noticing their matching rings and demanding to hear every detail of Charles's proposal. Stephen watched Charles tell the story, animated and happy, and felt a surge of love so strong it almost took his breath away. Sometime, Elena said when Charles finished, her eyes bright with tears. Stephen said, reaching for Charles's hand, "That means everything, having your support." "You'll always have it," Elena assured him. "Both of you. You're family now." On the drive home, Charles was quiet again, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that came from being completely at ease with another person. Stephen found himself thinking about family, about how it could be chosen as well as given, about how the people who truly loved you were the ones who accepted you exactly as you were. His parents still struggled with his relationship, still held out hope that he would come to his senses and return to the life they had envisioned for him. It hurt, but Stephen had made peace with their disappointment. He had Charles, he had Elena, he had the friends who celebrated their love and supported their relationship. He had chosen family, and that was enough. "What are you thinking about?" Charles asked as they pulled into their parking space. "Family thoughts," Stephen said. "How sometimes the people who love you best aren't the ones you're related to by blood." Charles smiled and squeezed his hand. "I know exactly what you mean. You and Elena and Maria and all our friends, you're my real family, the people who see me and love me for who I actually am." That evening, they cooked dinner together, moving around their small kitchen with the practiced ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms. Charles made his famous pasta sauce while Stephen prepared a salad and opened a bottle of wine. They ate at their little table, talking about their day, about their plans for apartment hunting, about Charles's latest project, and Stephen's upcoming presentation at work. It was such an ordinary evening, the kind they'd shared hundreds of times before, but Stephen found himself paying attention to every detail, storing it away in his memory. The way Charles gestured with his fork when he got excited about something, the sound of his laugh when Stephen told a particularly bad joke, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at Stephen across the table. After dinner, they settled on the couch to watch a movie, Charles curled against Stephen's side with his head on Stephen's shoulder. Halfway through the film, Charles fell asleep, and Stephen found himself more interested in watching Charles than the screen. Even in sleep, Charles looked peaceful and content, and Stephen felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that he had played a part in that contentment. This was what love looked like, Stephen realized. Not the dramatic passion of movies and novels, but this quiet, steady certainty, this sense of rightness, of being exactly where you belonged with exactly the right person. This knowledge that whatever challenges life might throw at them, they would face them together. As the credits rolled, Stephen gently woke Charles, who blinked up at him with sleepy confusion before smiling that soft, adoring smile that never failed to make Stephen's heart skip. Quote Boston, Charles asked, stretching and yawning. Quote Ahayana, quote Shane, Charles replied, leaning up to kiss Stephen softly. Quote Tarn, Stephen assured him, cupping Charles's face in his hands. We're real, and we're going to be real for a very long time. They went to bed soon after, falling into their nightly routine of getting ready together, brushing their teeth side by side in the bathroom mirror, changing into pajamas while talking about their plans for the next day. It was all so domestic and normal and perfect that Stephen sometimes had to pinch himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. In bed, they curled together, as they always did, Charles's head on Stephen's chest, Stephen's fingers running through Charles's hair. This was Stephen's favorite time of day, when the rest of the world faded away, and it was just the two of them, quiet and content and completely themselves. Stephen, Charles said quietly, his breath warm against Stephen's skin. Stephen considered this, thinking about the path his life had been on before Charles had answered his roommate ad. Quote 246. Quote 247, Charles said. Quote 200. Quote Tarifrani, Stephen said, pressing a kiss to the top of Charles's head. Against all odds, in a city of millions of people, we found each other. The best roommate ad response I ever got, Charles said with a sleepy chuckle. The best roommate I ever found, Stephen replied. As Charles drifted off to sleep in his arms, Stephen lay awake for a little while longer, thinking about the future they were building together. Tomorrow they would start looking at apartments, taking the next step in their journey together. Someday, maybe sooner than they expected, they would be able to legally marry, to make their commitment official in the eyes of the law as well as their hearts. But even without legal recognition, Stephen knew that what they had was real and lasting and true. They had chosen each other, had built something beautiful and strong together, had created a love that was uniquely theirs. Stephen closed his eyes and let himself drift towards sleep, secure in the knowledge that when he woke up, Charles would still be there, and they would have another day to love each other, another day to build their life together, another day to be grateful for the miracle of finding the right person at exactly the right time. The last thing Stephen thought before sleep claimed him was how grateful he was for that night months ago when he couldn't sleep, when he'd wandered out to the living room and found Charles working on his laptop. How grateful he was that Charles had suggested they try sleeping in the same room, that they had both been brave enough to acknowledge what was growing between them. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with the simplest moments, with someone saying they slept better near someone else, with someone asking if you'd stay a while. Sometimes the most profound changes in your life came disguised as practical solutions to everyday problems. Stephen Kim had found his home in Charles Rodriguez, and Charles had found his in Stephen. They had discovered that love wasn't always about grand gestures and dramatic declarations. Sometimes it was about quiet mornings and shared meals, and the simple comfort of sleeping beside someone who made you feel completely and utterly yourself. And as Stephen finally drifted off to sleep, Charles warm and solid in his arms, he knew with absolute certainty that they were both exactly where they needed to be.